Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you very much, Sandor. Nainamane, Nadlu Tampendi, Gana Mayuna, Yurta Matanya, Wamatara Nyako. Gana Mayunako Yutako, Taikaringa Tawila, Panako Tapa Puruna, Bulcha Yancha Kuma Nadlu, Panadlu Waru Telatina, Manpuriaru, Nadlu Tampendi, Ramanjeri, Naranjeri, Anangu, Adnamatna, Naranga, Mayuna Kuma Yalara, Mani Nabudni, Yanchu in Burundi, Gani Yatanga, Bulyanina Yatanga. Which, with respect to Ghana speakers, I have wished to say, we acknowledge the Ghana people and their spiritual relationship with the land as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region. We acknowledge their living culture, heritage and beliefs. We also acknowledge the Naranjeri, Ramanjeri, Anangu, Adnamatna and Naranga people here today and welcome them to this meeting on Ghana land. May we walk together in harmony and in a spirit of reconciliation. Now, I said that acknowledgement to country for two reasons. One, because it's important that we do that. But two, because there's actually a lot in that which is of relevance to this World Refugee Day Festival of Languages. You might have noticed that I mentioned we acknowledge also the Naranjeri, Ramanjeri, Anangu, Adnamatna and Naranga people. In fact, we sometimes say that Australia has become a multicultural country. The reality was it was a multicultural country before the first colonists came to this country 200 years ago. There were 230, well there are 230 known Aboriginal languages, not dialects, languages. Many of those languages have not died, they have fallen asleep. They have fallen asleep because they are no longer spoken. But before the first colonists came, they were being spoken vibrantly. Now, what happened when the first colonists came is huge disruption. You know the story of disruption. And Khadija, you have very powerfully shared that experience, your experience. And while your experience and the experience of each and every one is different, there are shared elements. And one element is the shared element of disruption. And so I want to read a little bit more in Ghana to you. And this is what it says. Nada Muriendi Adlu, Paini Paininga Adlu Yancha Tiki. Kujanalanda Kaneadlu Paru Panjinga Kujanila Yatanga. Yancha Atunatu Kundu Permayeta. It is most likely that that is the first recorded Ghana language that we have. Not the first language ever spoken in Ghana, but the first time it was written down. And that was written down by a fellow by the name of Teitelman, or two people, Teitelman and Schurman. And these were the words spoken by Mulawira Burka, who they couldn't say his name, so they called him King John. He was a Ghana elder at the time. But the power of what he said was in his language, but for us the power of what he said, we have to go to the translation. This is what Mulawira Burka said. Now let us go farther. Formerly, we lived here for a long time. Now, otherwhere, we must live. In another district. Here, I feel anxious in another district. What he was saying by that, he was in fact a refugee in his own land. He was dispossessed. He was disrupted. And there was a huge price to pay for that disruption. And one of the prices they paid for that disruption was the loss, or almost the loss, of their language. And in some Aboriginal peoples, it was the loss of their language. But in the case of the Ghana, they have been able, slowly but surely, 150 years later, 160 years later, to retrieve that language. And you may say, well, that's nice. That's important that we've not lost the language. But I want to say to you that it's much more than that. It's important because it actually has become recognized as an element of their identity, of who they are. And as they seek to find their own internal resilience to cope with the disruption of 200 years standing, it is actually often language that is helping them gain back their full identity. Now that's a message of some people who have been here a long time. You have not been here a long time. But I want to say to you that the role of language in your resilience is huge. There have been many academic studies done on this, and I can quote some. Olga Sanchez Castro and Jeffrey Gill have spoken on two perspectives on language maintenance. They wrote about the Salvadorian community, Los Salvadoreños in Queensland, and the Spanish community in South Australia. And one of the things they drew out of that study was that the Salvadorian community, by and large, have been refugees. The Spanish community, in one sense, were not so much refugees, though many of them were leaving the oppressive regime of Franco in the 1950s and 60s, but they weren't quite refugees in the sense of the Salvadorians who came from a very brutal civil war. And what they found was that the language maintenance needs were part of the survival strategies of these people when they came to Australia. And they were more importantly part of those who came as refugees. Another study, Aniko Hatos, who's done a paper on displacement, language maintenance and identity, the case of Sudanese refugees in Australia, makes a number of very important points about this. He says that language choice becomes a site of identity construction in relation to past, present and future. And that pride and resilience, feeding from their rich cultural traditions and their diverse linguistic repertoire in Sudan. Now, it's a very academic work, but the importance is the real heart of that. And that is that sometimes when people move to another place, there is a suspicion that they must abandon their language inheritance. And yet quite the contrary. Not only must they not abandon it, not only must they not abandon it because it becomes part of the linguistic tapestry of the country to which they move, and our tapestry in Australia is a much richer linguistic tapestry because we now recognise more properly the Aboriginal languages, many of which have fallen asleep, but also because we now recognise the languages that have been brought to this country. It has taken us a long time. It has taken us too long. Deetra talked about some of the challenges she has faced just in the last 13 years. But there were so many challenges before that too. Why can't you speak English? Why don't you go home if you can't speak English? There were cases of people who had to change their name. The first identified Greek settler in South Australia, when he died, had written on his birth certificate, George North. North is not a very Greek word. He was born Tramontanus, but because people couldn't say that, he had to change it. Now that was back in the 1840s. You say, well, that's okay. We don't do those things anymore. And yet I can tell you that we do. That in recent times, in current times, the essence behind such a thing is there. Why don't you speak English if you can't go home? And yet an important part of the coping strategy of a community is that they actually have their own community to act as a comfort. Back in 1994 to 96, my family and I left Australia to go and live in Spain. Now, I was the only member of the family who spoke any Spanish. We took our 5 children, who at that stage were between the ages of 11 and 14, and we landed in Spain, and 3 days later we enrolled them in Spanish government schools where they could not speak a word of Spanish. And one of the things I had to do, and my father who came with us, my parents came with us, for the first 3 months was to translate the questions of their homework so they knew what they were being asked. Because it took them some months to get the language, the Spanish language. Now, when they would go to school, and I've asked my children how did they cope with that, they said they felt overwhelmed. They didn't really know how they were going to cope. But when they came home, we were speaking English. In the home, they were able to have that anchor back to their identity. And what happened then? Did they remain just some English speakers, some Australians, in the middle of another continent, the other side of the globe? No, in fact, they became fully identified with the Spanish community. Ultimately, their Spanish, they all learned Spanish. Some of them learned it very well. Some of them didn't. 2 of the children didn't learn it particularly well, but that didn't matter. Others learned it fluently. And by the time we left Spain 2 years later, they had now become fully identified with the community. But in fact, that anchoring back into their own language was part of that process. If they'd have been told you're not allowed to speak English at all, then they would have suffered. Now, of course, their experience was nowhere near as profound as the experience that many of you have had, because we were not refugees in Spain. We had not seen the very basis of the entire community where we lived being so shattered that we had to flee. If you add that on top, then language becomes even more important still. Because it becomes a recognition of who you are when so many of the other identity markers, if you like, of who you are have evaporated or have been shattered. So this theme of your conference, to have it on World Refugee Day, I think is a wonderful idea. There are people who say we should speak more languages. I'm one of them. When I was Minister of Education, I encouraged the learning of languages in our schools, the languages other than English program in our primary schools, the South Australian School of Languages, gave more support to ethnic schools, and other language programs. And I had some people say, oh, this is really wonderful that you're doing this, because that then means that we can trade better. We can do things overseas because we can actually speak the languages. Well, yes, that's important. But I didn't believe that was the reason that all this needed to happen. I believe the reason this needed to happen is that if we are genuinely to become a multicultural country, we actually need to grow together in a new tapestry, a rich tapestry, that is itself woven with strands that are identifiable, and that those strands are distinctive. And so the ethnic schools, for example, help that happen. The South Australian Secondary School of Languages helps that happen. It helps language maintenance take place. Now, one of the things that you need to think about is how will you maintain your language richness that you now bring as a gift to the conjunction that we call Australia, so that once again it will be a multilingual country. So I encourage you not only to think about how you speak in home and family, but to actually take part in the preservation of that in the wider context. About 3 months ago, we lost a linguistic treasure in South Australia, a literary treasure in South Australia. A fellow by the name of Luis Sanchez Cunhat. Luis came to Australia in the early 1980s, a published author, and he would write and be published until the last years of his life. And he lived in Australia from the early 1980s. But Lewis only ever wrote in Spanish. And he published in Spanish. And he was genuinely an Australian writer. And I just thought that was wonderful. That we can have the context, that we can be a source of culture for the world. And it will be a culture that is differentiated by having been in Australia. Because though Lewis wrote in Spanish, he was an Australian writing in Spanish because he had been here 20, 30 years when he in this period of writing. And so it was flavoured by being in this country. So as you have your various languages, you too might want to think about that. How can you give that as a literary, cultural gift to the world, flavoured by being here as Australians in Australia? When that happens, we have the opportunity to become the most exciting, rich, vibrant, multicultural place in the world. I congratulate you on this conference. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope that you appreciate the context of it in this World Refugee Day. But more importantly than all of that, I hope that what comes out of this for you becomes profoundly significant. Thank you.